In the years after World War I, many Americans believed they were living in a confident new era. Industry was booming, consumer goods were spreading, and people talked as if modern science and business had finally tamed the old cycles of boom and bust. Radios, refrigerators, telephones, and automobiles drew people into a new world of convenience and connection. For the first time, many households could listen to the same music or news at the same time, and that shared excitement helped fuel the feeling that anything was possible. Rising stock prices and steady job growth made it seem as if prosperity might stretch on forever. Newspapers trumpeted record profits, and many families began to think that the tough times of the past truly were behind them. The Roaring Twenties were not only economic, they were cultural. Jazz music, dance crazes, and more relaxed social norms spread through cities and into smaller towns, giving the era an energy that felt modern and a little rebellious. Advertising became more sophisticated, promising happiness, success, and status to anyone who bought the right products. Billboards, magazines, and radio jingles all whispered the same message. Buying more was the path to a better life. Assembly lines and mass production made goods cheaper and more widely available. Workers repeated the same tasks on factory floors, turning out cars, radios, and clothing at rates that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. While urban and suburban areas celebrated, many farmers never fully shared in the boom. Saddled with wartime debts and facing low prices for crops, they struggled quietly even as city headlines shouted about prosperity. Installment buying allowed families to take home radios, furniture, and cars without paying the full price up front. This new flow of credit made life more comfortable in the short term, but it also left many households deeply in debt if anything went wrong. Even during the good times, wealth was unevenly shared. A small percentage of Americans controlled a large share of the nation's income and assets, while many workers and farmers lived on thin margins with little cushion against future shocks. By the end of the decade, the American economy looked impressive on the surface, but beneath that shine lay fragile banks, risky loans, and people stretched thin by debt. The foundation had cracks that most people could not yet see. As companies chased profits, many factories produced more goods than consumers could buy. Warehouses filled with unsold inventory, but managers kept the machines running, hoping demand would catch up. At the same time, household debt crept upward. Families juggling installment plans and loans often didn't realize how vulnerable they were. As long as jobs seemed secure and wages kept coming, farm incomes in many regions slid even lower. Mechanization and global competition pushed crop prices down, leaving farmers with little to pay back loans, buy new equipment, or support their families. Banks sat at the center of these webs of credit. Many had loaned heavily to investors and farmers, or speculated in markets themselves, making them dangerously exposed if borrowers could not repay. Speculation in the stock market reached frenzied levels. People took loans to buy stocks they barely understood, confident that prices would keep rising and that they could sell before anything went wrong. A handful of economists and cautious investors warned that the market was overheated and fragile. But in the noise of rising prices and good news, those warnings were easy to laugh off or ignore. Some companies used creative accounting or optimistic forecasts to hide just how shaky their finances were. On paper, they looked strong, but behind the balance sheets they carried debts and risks that would soon be revealed. Prices for crops and raw materials drifted downward, squeezing farmers and miners alike. Even as cities appeared to shine, people who produced the basic goods of the economy were feeling the pinch. For many rural families, hardship was not a sudden surprise, but a grinding reality. They tightened belts year after year, even before the word depression became part of everyday conversation. By 1929, those cracks in farming, credit, and corporate finance had spread quietly across the nation. The economy still looked impressive from a distance, but it was increasingly fragile underneath. In October 1929, stock prices began to wobble and jitter instead of gliding steadily upward. Traders felt something was wrong, but no one knew whether it was a small bump or the start of something much bigger. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, selling surged. Prices dropped sharply and crowds gathered outside the exchange to watch the drama unfold. The confidence of the boom suddenly felt very far away. Major bankers met and agreed to buy large blocks of stock to show faith in the market. For a moment, their intervention seemed to work, and prices steadied, like a sheet held over a crack in the ice. The calm did not last. On October 29, Black Tuesday, a torrent of sell orders overwhelmed the exchange. Prices collapsed, wiping out fortunes and sending shockwaves deep into the financial system. Investors who had borrowed to buy stocks faced margin calls. They had to repay loans or provide more cash just when everything they owned was losing value. Many were forced to sell at the worst possible moment. President Hoover assured the country that the fundamentals were sound and that the panic would pass. But for many Americans watching their savings and jobs disappear, these words felt distant and inadequate. Confidence is one of the hardest things to measure and the easiest to lose. After the crash, more and more people questioned whether banks, businesses, and even the government really knew what they were doing. As orders dried up, factories reduced shifts or shut down lines. Workers were sent home early or told not to come back at all, starting a chain reaction from businesses to families and whole neighborhoods. With each wave of layoffs, more families lost their main source of income. At first, people hoped the cuts were temporary, but as weeks turned to months, rising unemployment became frighteningly familiar. The crash and its aftermath rippled overseas. Banks and businesses in Europe that depended on American loans or trade found themselves in trouble too, spreading the hardship far beyond U.S. borders. As loans went bad and reserves ran short, more banks began to fail. Each failure frightened depositors at other banks, making them wonder if their savings were safe anywhere. Rumors that a bank might be in trouble could spark a run, as depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Without deposit insurance, once a bank's cash ran out, everyone behind them in line often lost everything. For families who had carefully saved for years, a sudden bank failure could erase a lifetime of work. Without savings, even the smallest emergency became a serious threat. Prices for many goods fell, which sounds helpful until you realize it made debts effectively heavier. Businesses hesitated to invest and hire if they expected tomorrow's prices to be lower than today's. In many towns, the factory was the heart of the local economy. When entire production lines shut down, it meant not just lost wages, but fewer customers for shops, barbers, and cafes nearby. Hoover believed strongly in limited government and voluntary cooperation. He encouraged charities and local communities to step up, but avoided large direct federal aid, a stance that many Americans grew to resent as conditions worsened. With nowhere else to go, many homeless families built shacks from scrap materials on empty land and in city parks. These shantytowns, nicknamed Hoovervilles, were a visible symbol of anger at the administration. World War I veterans converged on Washington in 1932 to demand early payment of promised bonuses. When their camps were cleared by troops and tanks, many Americans were shocked by the harsh response to men who had served their country. Each new bank failure, breadline, and protest added to political pressure. Americans began searching for leaders who would try something different, even if it meant breaking older ideas about government and the economy. Across the country, families watched foreclosure notices nailed to doors and fence posts. Losing a home or farm meant not just financial loss, but the shattering of stability and belonging. In big cities, long breadlines became an everyday sight. People waited quietly, often in the cold, for a bowl of soup or a loaf of bread that might be the only substantial food they had that day. Churches, charities, and community groups organized soup kitchens to feed the hungry. These improvised aid posts were examples of compassion in a time of scarcity, but they also underscored how deep the need had become. Families cut expenses wherever they could. Clothes were patched and repatched, meat disappeared from dinners, and small luxuries like candies or movies became rare treats, if they appeared at all. Children in Depression-era households often shouldered new responsibilities, caring for siblings, helping with chores, or even leaving school to work. Their childhoods were shaped by adult worries they could not fully escape. Facing common hardship, many neighborhoods developed informal networks of mutual aid. People shared food, passed along tips about jobs, and traded skills to keep everyone afloat. African American workers, who already faced discrimination, were often the last hired and first fired. Segregation and prejudice limited access to relief and jobs, deepening inequalities that had begun long before the Depression. Immigrant families often lived in crowded conditions and worked low-paid jobs even before the crash. In the Depression, some faced hostility and blame, yet many immigrant communities also showed powerful internal solidarity and support. Some Americans, mostly men but not only, took to the rails, hopping freight trains to roam the country searching for work. They created their own codes and etiquette, a shadow network of travelers shaped by the times. Even in hard times, people looked for small joys, a neighbor's joke, a song on the radio, a borrowed book, or a shared game at the kitchen table. These moments did not erase hardship, but helped people endure it. By the early 1930s, many Americans were convinced that old approaches had failed. As elections approached, they looked toward leaders who promised bold experimentation and a willingness to try new ideas. In 1932, voters chose Franklin D. Roosevelt in a landslide, signaling a desire for change. His promise of a New Deal raised expectations that the federal government would take a more active role in fighting the Depression. Roosevelt spoke of experimentation, arguing that if one approach didn't work, the government should try another. His willingness to act contrasted sharply with the cautious policies of the previous administration. Soon after taking office, FDR declared a national bank holiday, temporarily closing banks so officials could inspect them. This bold move stopped the immediate wave of withdrawals and gave the system room to breathe. Through his fireside chats, Roosevelt spoke directly to the American people in simple language, explaining policies and asking for patience. Many felt they had, for the first time, a president who was speaking with them instead of at them. The Civilian Conservation Corps gave young men work in parks and forests, sending most of their wages back home. They planted trees, built trails, and helped fight erosion, while gaining meals, shelter, and a sense of purpose. The Works Progress Administration employed millions in building roads, schools, and public buildings, and even in creating art, theater, and writing projects that enriched cultural life. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration tried to raise farm prices by paying farmers to reduce production. Controversial and imperfect, it marked a new level of federal involvement in agriculture. The New Deal changed what people expected from Washington. The federal government began to see itself not just as a referee, but as a player in relief, job creation, and economic management. Some critics argued the New Deal went too far, threatening free enterprise and expanding government power. Others argued it did too little for those most in need. The New Deal sparked debates that continue in American politics to this day. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression by itself, but it helped stabilize the system, gave millions of people work, and reshaped the relationship between citizens and their government in lasting ways. In the Great Plains, years of drought and overplowing turned once rich soil into dust. Fields that had produced bumper crops now cracked under the sun, leaving farmers desperate. Dust storms, sometimes called black blizzards, roared across farms and towns, blotting out the sun. Dust seeped into houses, covering furniture and food, making everyday life a constant battle against nature. Breathing in fine dust day after day caused respiratory illnesses nicknamed dust pneumonia. Doctors did what they could, but in many rural areas, medical care was hard to reach. Faced with ruined farms and mounting debts, many families packed what they could onto cars and trucks and headed west along roads like Route 66, hoping to find work and a safer life. California and other western states saw a surge of migrants, often labeled Okies no matter where they came from. They arrived hoping for steady work in orchards, fields, and canneries. In migrant camps, families lived in tents or shacks, sharing crowded facilities and competing for seasonal jobs. They created communities despite the instability, yet often faced prejudice and low pay. Photographers, writers, and painters documented the hardships of the Depression and Dust Bowl. Their images and stories brought distant suffering into the living rooms and offices of people who might never see those places themselves. Musicians wrote songs about losing farms, riding the rails, and looking for work. These folk songs turned personal pain into shared art, helping people feel less alone in their struggles. The Second New Deal expanded earlier efforts with new programs and reforms, from Social Security to stronger labor protections. It aimed not only to relieve suffering, but to reshape how the economy worked. By the late 1930s, many Americans were simply tired. Tired of bad news, lean years, and arguments about what should be done. Yet the country had also developed new habits of cooperation and caution that would shape the future. When war erupted in Europe and Asia, American factories gradually shifted toward producing weapons and supplies for allies. This surge in demand pulled idle plants and workers back into motion, helping to lift the country out of the Depression. Wartime mobilization finally erased the last traces of mass unemployment. The Great Depression ended not through a single policy or speech, but through an enormous, costly global conflict that demanded every ounce of industrial strength the United States could muster. Programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance, created in the 1930s, became permanent features of American life. They provided a baseline of security for older adults and people who lost jobs, slowly changing how families planned for the future. Banking and securities reforms made after the crash strengthened the financial system. Deposit insurance reassured savers, and regulators watched markets more closely to reduce the risk of another 1929-style collapse. Those who lived through the Great Depression often kept the habits they learned, saving carefully, avoiding waste, and thinking twice before borrowing. Their stories shaped the attitudes of children and grandchildren long after the economy recovered. Our tiny storytellers remind us that the Great Depression was not just a single crash, but a long, difficult era that tested people's courage and creativity. By learning how Americans endured, adapted, and changed their institutions, we can better understand what it takes to face future crises with compassion, flexibility, and clear eyes.